Hey everyone, it's Sevy. I'm back with the third and final video of this Furina team building guide series. If you haven't yet, I do suggest watching my main Furina guide and the first parts of this series since they establish a lot of Furina's kit and team building considerations, as well as cover many other team templates, healer options, units, and so on. Anyway, in this video, I'll mainly discuss Furina's place in Dendro-based teams, followed by her synergy with specific units and teams that didn't fall under the topics of the previous videos. Let's get into it. To start us off, I'll first go over our Dendro and Electro healer options since they'll commonly pop up in our Dendro team discussions. Healers from other elements will also be recommended sometimes, but I've already discussed them in detail from my previous team guides. Starting with Dendro, Baizhu is the most comfortable healer to work with as he provides instant party-wide healing with his skill, periodic active character healing while his burst is active, and interruption resistance via his refreshing shield, which will be very appreciated by on-field units that hate getting staggered. But more than that, Baizhu also provides offensive buffs since his passive helps increase the damage of Dendro-related reactions. It's also possible to make him a non-field driver where he uses his normally charged attacks for additional single-target Dendro application. All in all, Baizhu has a very useful mix of both survival and offensive support utilities, and his value has certainly gone up thanks to Furina. The alternative Dendro healer is Yaoyao, and the key difference is that she needs more on-field time to do her full party healing through her burst, compared to Baizhu, who can just skill and burst to activate his healing abilities, then switch out if you're not using him for driving. Yaoyao's ideal synergy is in teams who are giving her on-field time won't be detrimental to the team's rotation time or damage output. Quick swap teams can best accommodate Yaoyao's burst healing since she won't be stealing valuable field time from another teammate. However, even in teams with an on-field carry taking a lot of field time, Yaoyao can still work as long as you're mindful of the rotation time. Another thing you can do for extra healing is putting Prototype Amber on Nahida. If you really want more healing, you can even consider giving Nahida a healing bonus circlet at the expense of her EM or crit circlet. However, it might be difficult trying to make Nahida work as your only healer, so I recommend combining her with another healing source if ever. For instance, if you combine her party-wide healing with Kuki's single-target healing, they can actually make a good enough pair to sustain the team. Speaking of Kuki, let's go through our Electro healers. When it comes to Kuki, she has pure single-target healing capabilities, but since Kuki also makes a convenient Hyperbloom trigger, she still has a lot of value. You could either pair her with another healer who provides party-wide healing if you want more comfort, or you could use a rotation that distributes her healing ticks throughout your party members, which is more feasible in quick swap teams. Having Kuki C2 will also be especially helpful since C2 extends her range duration, so that's more Electro application and healing uptime. While most people won't even bother with Dori, she can still be a viable healer and Hyperbloom trigger, especially with C6. Without C6, her healing is mainly single target as well, so you'll either have to make a rotation that distributes her healing or supplement her with another party-wide healer. Triggering Hyperblooms with her bursts Electro line might also require a bit more management. However, if your Dori is C6, she actually gets pretty decent party-wide healing capabilities. After using her skill, she infuses her normal attacks with Electro for 3 seconds, and hitting enemies while infused gives full party healing, which scales on her max HP. The Electro-infused attacks can also trigger Hyperblooms, so that's a nice quality of life improvement for her gameplay. I also haven't forgotten the possibility of using Lisa with a Prototype Amber, but I don't really recommend this option since she'd be better built as a DPS, and her burst isn't as easily spammable due to her energy needs. Let's move on to the Dendro team template, starting with Quickbloom. Quickbloom teams are called as such because they try to maintain the quicken aura to allow your Electro and Dendro units to proc aggravate and spread reactions respectively, while still generating Dendro cores and triggering Hyperblooms. But in order to maintain quicken uptime on enemies, your Hydro application should be slow enough that it won't easily overwhelm the quicken aura. Thankfully, Furina fits that role very well since her Hydro app comes in varying intervals and isn't too fast. And while Furina doesn't buff Hyperbloom reactions, Furina does buff spread and aggravate, so she gets a lot more mileage in Quickbloom teams than in Hyperbloom focused teams. So for the team template, we need a Dendro and Electro unit who will each provide consistent elemental application to trigger quicken-based reactions. That leaves a fourth slot, which can either be Dendro or Electro as well. We have several spread and aggravate DPS options that you can build your Quickbloom team around. Alhaitham is a prime example of a spread DPS along with Nahida and Tighnari. Furina is particularly convenient for Tighnari since his charge attack playstyle can't really drive Xingqiu and Yelan's Hydro attacks, so Furina's automatic pet attacks have more synergy with him. Of course, you'd need an Electro teammate who will maintain the quicken aura and trigger Hyperblooms. Raiden, Kuki, and Yae are my top go-to teammates for that role. So for example, in an Alhaitham or Tighnari team, I could put Baizhu as the second Dendro, and while I normally use Kuki as my Electro trigger, I could switch to Raiden or Yae instead, since Baiju's healing is enough to sustain the team. Or I could still use Nahida and Kuki, but I'd equip Nahida with a prototype Amber, so I don't have to rely on Kuki's healing alone.
The Temple of Wisdom. Our bond is strong.
Deflect.
I'll settle this. Shower me with praise. Time to shine. The doctor will see.
Seems like an emergency.
One with the force. I hear everything.
On the other hand, we can go for an aggravate-focused Quickbloom team with an Electro DPS taking the lead. Cyno is very strong in this template, and he consolidates both the aggravate DPS and Hyperbloom trigger role. A premium team would be Furina, Baizhu, and Nahida. All their buffs are combined for Cyno to boost his damage even further, and their abilities' durations are long enough to last throughout most of Cyno's field time. It's a pretty expensive team, but the result is very strong, and one of Cyno's best teams.
Sharing my knowledge. Strike a pose. Time to shine. The doctor will see.
Remember,
Your sins weigh upon your soul. Guilty. You stand condemned. Guilty.
Alternatively, Keqing, Raiden, or Yae could be your Electro DPS instead, and they'll fulfill a similar role of triggering Aggravate and Hyperblooms. If you don't have 5 stars, then there are still strong 4-star Electro units to work with. Another option is a very quick swap-oriented team. Your party members are composed of units where no one really needs strictly long on-field time. Here's an example team where Nahida is triggering spreads, Fischl is triggering Aggravates, and Kuki is triggering both Aggravates and Hyperblooms. Furina's damage bonus buffs all of the spread and Aggravate damage being dealt, so everyone's benefiting from her buff. Since you can easily swap around to distribute healing, even using Kuki as a solo healer can still be quite comfortable.
Midnight Bandit. I'll settle this. Commit it to memory.
Moving on, if you increase the Hydro application by adding a second Hydro unit, that leads to less quicken uptime but increased Dendro core generation, which allows you to trigger more Hyperblooms. The team template is basically a Dendro unit, Furina plus another Hydro, and an Electro trigger. Furina offers full uptime on her Hydro application, and her pet's attacks are automatic, which can be convenient. But since Hyperbloom damage is a transformative reaction, her damage bonus buff doesn't affect it. Nevertheless, she still buffs your team's raw damage, so it's not entirely wasted, especially when Furina and your second Hydro unit could output a good deal of raw Hydro damage that makes up a noticeable portion of the team's damage output. For the second Hydro unit, that could be an off-fielder like Yelan or Xingqiu, who will be driven by an on-field unit, a healer like Kokomi or Barbara, who could instead be your on-field driver, or just an on-field DPS like Ayato or Nivelette. For the Dendro unit, the ideal options are either Baizhu or Nahida. Other Dendro units may work, but will have varying synergies depending on how much Dendro application they can offer, or how much on-field time they required to do so. As for your Electro trigger, it could be someone who consolidates healing as well, like Kuki or Dori, especially if your Hydro or Dendro units don't offer any healing. But if you've already got the healing part covered, then there's room to make the Electro unit not a healer anymore.
Shower me with praise. Let the world come. Let the show. Ha! Ha! Lightning shower ball. Dissipate. Go, Barbara, go! Scatter! No! Committed to memory. Sharing my knowledge. Yoo-hoo! Let my name echo
You could also just have a Hyperbloom core of Furina, Dendro, and Electro, then the 4th slot could be occupied by any unit that could take an on-field role, heal, or whatever, as long as they won't mess up the Hyperbloom reaction process. Again, just be mindful that since Furina's Hydro application by herself isn't as fast, then her Dendro core generation as a solo Hydro will be more limited. There's a lot of options in that case. For example, your 4th slot could be a Cryo unit which introduces freeze reactions to help crowd control enemies, and can also trigger Superconduct to reduce enemies' physical resistance. I could put Chi-Chi or Charlotte, who can be the team's healer, so I don't need to run a Dendro or Electro healer anymore. Another example is Noelle, since GEO also doesn't disrupt the Hyperbloom setup, and she could also just be the team healer. Whoever you would decide to use for your 4th slot, just remember to account for your healer as always. If you use a healer flex unit, then that gives you leeway to no longer run Dendro or Electro healers. But if you use a purely offensive flex unit, then naturally you'd need the Dendro or Electro healer. Now, for Burgeon teams, it's the same principle as Hyperbloom teams, except now we're using a Pyro trigger rather than Electro. While it's generally a less played template, it can still be effective, especially in multi-target scenarios where there's a lot of enemies to trigger cores from and hit with Burgeon's AoE damage. For our Pyro trigger, Thoma is quite convenient to work with. His Pyro application just needs to be driven with normal attacks, plus he generates shields to reduce the damage we take, and he doesn't need much field time. Just ensure he gets enough energy to burst. I generally prefer using him for my Burgeon teams. Still, other Pyro units can also be less typical Burgeon triggers as long as their Pyro attacks can reliably and consistently hit the Dendro cores. Another unconventional route is to use an animal unit that can self-infuse Pyro to trigger Burgeons. For example, using Sayu with a Pyro unit like Dia or Bennett will allow her to roll around and infuse Pyro, and she's triggering cores while simultaneously healing the team when she swirls. Another variant is Kazuha and Bennett, wherein Kazuha's burst is infused with Pyro. These aren't the most efficient Burgeon variants I'd recommend, but they are options if you want to try something different. Furina's Hydro application is somewhat slow, so if she's a solo Hydro unit, it's harder for her to counter the burning aura. However, one upside of inflicting more burning uptime is that Furina has more chances of triggering a forward vaporize reaction, which can still deal very good damage. This makes your damage source a mix of vapes and Burgeons. But if you want to maximize Burgeon damage, having a second Hydro unit to make this a double Hydro team will minimize the burning aura to potentially help create more Dendro cores to trigger into Burgeons.
No, my soul! Witness that!
Mind the side effects. Taking a turn for the better.
Fire it up! Here's backup!
The doctor will see you. Make yourselves at home.
Let's move it again.
Allow me. Time to shine.
She's supporting fire!
I see everything. Billowing surge.
Inserting a Cryo or Electro in the 4th slot can also help lessen the burning aura, but it also turns the team into a cocktail of different reactions than just a Burgeon-oriented team. All in all, I generally recommend Quickbloom or Hyperbloom teams more often over Burgeon, as I think they're overall easier to manage and have more flexible team options. But if you have the right units for a synergistic Burgeon team, and if you use it in AoE scenarios where it can be the most effective, then Burgeon can still do the job well enough. Finally, we have the Nilou Bloom team, limited to teammates of only Hydro and Dendro. Since the majority of your damage will come from Nilou's bountiful cores, Furina's damage percent bonus is a bit wasted here. Furina also puts your survivability on hard mode, since you now have to contend with her HP drain and the bountiful core self-damage, so you'll need a very competent healer. Furina and Nilou's combined Hydro application is already good enough, so you'll want to balance that with 2 other Dendro units, which means you'll need to have a Dendro healer. If you do a triple Hydro team, that would significantly slow down your Dendro core generation, so it's not as recommended. So for Dendro units, Yaoyao or Baizhu can effectively sustain your team and provide Dendro application over time. If you're using one of these healers plus Nahida and feel like you need the added comfort, you could always put a prototype Amber on Nahida for more healing. One upside to Furina's presence here is that the long duration of her skill and Hydro application makes your rotations even looser and more flexible. You're also not pressured to continuously use normal attacks to apply Hydro like with Yelan, Xingqiu, or Kokomi. money. And any EM substats you get in Furina will also have more value, since it's likely she'll be triggering a lot of bountiful cores. Still, this doesn't make Furina necessarily more preferable than other Hydro units you could be comping with Nilou, and Furina's utilities, especially her team damage bonus, can be better maximized than other team comps. Nevertheless, she can still work well with Nilou if your other Hydro units are occupied. Now, let's just go highlight a couple more teams and unit synergies with Furina that don't strictly rely on elemental reaction templates. Noelle and Furina are a very convenient pairing, as Noelle consolidates the role of the on-field DPS, driver, and healer. Her strong healing easily counteracts Furina's HP drain and generates fanfare stacks faster. In some teams, she could be a solo Geo on-field driver and healer, in which case she'll just occupy any compatible flex slot of previous teams I may have already discussed. She won't be the team's highest damage source, but at the very least, she will provide consistent healing. And it's super convenient that Noelle's Geo infusion won't disappear even if you switch her out, so her rotations are more flexible. Don't forget to build her with enough ER too, especially in such a team where you're not using her with another Geo teammate. She can't generate Geo particles herself, so she needs to rely on her teammates' particles and enemy particles to recharge her burst. Having Favonius users on the team will certainly help, or you could even give Noelle herself the Favonius Greatsword so she can become the battery for your entire team. Her healing requires her shield to be active though, so ideally it should last for the most part of your rotation. If you think it breaks too early, you can strengthen it by giving her equipment that boosts her defense or shield strength. Even opting for a defense goblet rather than a Geo damage goblet can be an option for more security, and at least Furina's damage bonus buff compensates for that. Noelle can also equip an Archaic Petra set in a mono Hydro team to give her teammates a Hydro damage bonus buff if you want to further maximize team damage. Another way to play her, especially if you want to see big Geo numbers, is making a Noelle hyper carry team. You ideally want C6 Noelle to unlock her maximum potential, and if you're trying to run a triple Geo team, it requires specific Geo members that you might not have depending on how long you've played and what banners you pulled on. I typically run Goro and Yunjin as their combined buffs can really boost Noelle's numbers, but there are other Geo units like Albedo, Zhongli, or even Geo Traveler that you could slot into a triple Geo comp. With Geo members generating particles for each other, that'll also help address Noelle's inability to generate particles for herself. Since Noelle keeps her infusion even when swapping, you can use her teammate skills in the middle of the rotation to funnel particles around. However, it's not out of the question to slot in another element instead of a third Geo unit. For example, I would opt to use Yelan as an alternative, which makes this a dual Geo Hydro team. If you only end up with 2 Geos on the team, you do lose Goro's triple Geo party bonuses. However, you can still get other valuable benefits that more than make up for it. With Yelan, she offers a lot of off-field Hydro damage, lower ER needs for Furina, and an increasing damage buff to the active character. It takes quite a lot of investment to make Noelle a strong hyper carry, so only do it if you're really a huge fan of this maid knight. Another Geo hyper carry team can be led by Itto, which would be Itto, Goro, Furina, and a flex slot for healing. Even if Goro has C4, he only provides healing to the active character, and the healing isn't that large, and it won't be enough to keep up with Furina's HP drain. So at the end of the day, you still need a good source of healing. If you want to maintain the triple Geo comp, then your choice would be a prototype Amber Ningguang that's on a healer build, meaning using a healing bonus circlet and healing sets. When I tried this, the healing was actually comfortable enough against the boss half of the Abyss. It can still be challenging to sustain against the burning combo of the Pyrolector and Dendro Breacher Primus, so it depends a lot on the combat scenario. Alternatively, you could just slot in another element for a healer at the expense of not maximizing Goro's buff, but if the healer provides a comfortable experience for you or potentially consolidates more utilities than just healing, like using Bennett for his buff, then the trade-off would still be good. That said, Furina makes a great teammate for both our Geo DPSs to boost their damage and provide off-field Hydro damage, which gives more variety to those mono Geo teams. Then, Furina essentially joins the likes of Yelan and Xingqiu as a trio of staple off-field Hydro units, and if you combine her with one or even both of them to create a mono Hydro team, that can result in a lot of combined Hydro damage. Having 3 Hydro units also has a huge benefit of very significantly lowering all of your Hydro units' ER stats, allowing you to run more offensive stats on them. There are multiple variations you can create as long as you have an on-field driver and a healer on the team. Sometimes one character can even fulfill both those roles already. For example, you can have Furina, Xingqiu, and Yelan together, then there will be an on-field driver and healer. Jean is one good pick as she shreds the enemy's Hydro resistance with a VV set, she can heal a lot, and her normal attacks have a chance of triggering healing too, which she'll get a lot of opportunity to do if she's driving on field. Or Kokomi could be one of the Hydro units instead, who's also driving with on-field Hydro damage while giving so much healing. That team could be something like Kokomi, Furina, Xingqiu or Yelan, and then a 4th flex slot, preferably an Animo unit to shred Hydro resistance too. And that's it for this Furina team building series. There are a lot of particular units, pairings, or team synergies between Furina and other characters, since Furina's kit allows her to be a relatively universal unit that can benefit many types of teams and DPSs, as long as your healing is answered for. I haven't explored all of them at length within this video series, but since it has become quite long and we've already gone through a lot of major elemental reactions and team templates, I'll be cutting it off here. You'll still be seeing a lot of her in the future though. Furina will likely become a stable teammate in many Genshin players' accounts, so she'll pop up time and time again in future guides of characters, whether old ones being revisited or newer ones as they release. If you watch this entire series, I really appreciate your dedication, and it was really interesting trying out so many teams with her. I hope players continue experimenting to find new and fun ways to play her, and that her team synergies keep expanding as more Fontaine characters roll out. Let me know in the comments which Furina teams are your favorite, whether from the templates featured here, in the previous videos, or just who you regularly play her with. If this video helped you out, don't forget to leave a like, consider subscribing to my channel if you haven't already, and I will see you all soon. Take care!